Some people might have not realized this, but the release of the Krasue was one of the most important milestones for Dead by Daylight. It was the first time that the developers fully embraced local folklore to design one of their killers, and you can tell that they went the extra mile to make it authentic. They literally did take extra miles to fly all the way to Thailand and present it and promote it. And overall, the first impression was incredibly good with the community. Her visceral nature and disgusting design was unlike anything else we had had in the game at the time, and most of us, myself included, were pretty impressed. Oh my god, okay, I think that's the goriest we've ever seen in this game. And so the question is, did the Krasue live up to all of this anticipation and all of this hype by the time she came out? Were people excited to play her, and was she popular in the player base? Well, one way to look at it is to check the public data and compare her to other killers that came out at the same time. First, we have something like Ghoul, who had a monstrously high pick rate of 28%. That means that more than 1 in 4 people playing killer at the time of his release were picking the Ghoul. And it's obvious why. He was a popular license, he was very, very strong, easy to play, lots of things to find appealing about him. Perhaps a more apt comparison would be to go for another unlicensed killer. This one didn't have a lot of promotion, the Houndmaster. She was fairly strong, but did have some issues. Despite that, she had a very respectable 10% pick rate by the time she was released. And about a month later, this pick rate had gone down to 4%, which isn't amazing, but it is understandable considering that we have so many killers in the roster. Now, let's look at how Krasue did. Similar to Houndmaster, her pick rate on the first month of release was actually pretty good, around 10%, which is not bad at all. But if we'll go 1 month after her release, her pick rate had plummeted to nearly 2%, below 2% in fact. And if you look at it right now, as of right now, it often goes around 1%, sometimes even below 1%. This is a massive fall off. No other killer has fallen off this quickly, this hard. And it's important to keep in mind that the Krasue was the only killer in years where the next chapter was delayed for several months. So she was the most recent player character for a much longer time than any other character and still received such low pick rates from the players. Why is this the case? What exactly happened to the Krasue? That's what we're gonna find out in this video. When the Krasue was initially released, the community quickly realized that she was a monster. Arguably stronger than Nerfs and certainly much easier to play than other S tiers, this killer was incredibly oppressive and it drove people to disconnect and give up at a rate that was unheard of at least since the school merchant times. I started playing her and the wins kept piling up, and before I knew it, I had 50 wins on her with barely any effort. I have a series on my channel where I try to get 50 wins on a variety of killers, and let me tell you, by far this was the easiest one out of all of the ones that I've done. And it came down to mostly 2 things. Number 1, she was incredibly oppressive in chase and could down you pretty much anywhere regardless of resources. And number 2, she was also incredibly good at tunneling people right off the hook. And these are the kind of issues that we normally would have pointed out and identified during the playtesting of the killer in the PTB for the Krasue. But unfortunately we didn't, because the Krasue in the PTB was incredibly awkward. Her movement was very clunky, she got stuck around corners constantly, and she couldn't really hit you around so many obstacles. So we didn't really see it at the time that once this killer got a few fixes, she would become really strong in chase. Her tunneling in the PTB was also not identified as a problem, because in this same PTB, the developers implemented a new change that made tunneling for all killers incredibly punishing. It really was an awful idea to tunnel someone aggressively, because if you did, you would lose out on certain bonuses, and you would also give buffs to survivors on their gen speed that would absolutely destroy you as a killer. By the time she came to life, of course, this change was completely scrapped, and without this punishing mechanic holding her back, the Krasue was now incredibly good at targeting survivors right off the hook and getting rid of them extremely quickly. Every match would follow the same formula. First, you would start in human form and try to infect the survivors. Infecting them was incredibly easy because you could spam the ability, and even if you miss, it didn't matter. You just kept doing it, and you didn't really slow down at all, and there was pretty much no cooldown, so you could maybe then follow that up with a basic attack or even switch to head form right away. And then once you were in head form, the survivor would be completely at your mercy. Even without any supporting perks, you were so much faster, had third person, you could hit them everywhere, follow them through pallets if they drop one, and no matter where they run, you would pretty much get a down guaranteed in seconds, and once they came out of the hook, they would still be infected, so as I said earlier, they would be an easy prey to a little quick tunnel, and then they were out. The only official data that we have from the developers places the Krasue as the #1 deadliest killer in the entire game, although I suspect that if we were to isolate this data to the time when she was the strongest, this number would possibly be even higher. Shortly after her release, the developers put out a series of hotfixes aimed to bring the Krasue to a more acceptable power level, and in this regard they were pretty successful. After her nerfs, the Krasue was now a killer that was strong, but not too strong. But perhaps they did make these changes a little bit too fast, because with these nerfs also returned some of the clunkiness and sluggishness that was characteristic of the Krasue in the PTB. Things like getting stunned by pallets now felt very bad, especially for newer players that might have been considering whether or not to pick up this character. A few weeks after her release, when most people had already tried it, there were now very few reasons to try her out for a new player. If you look at her perks, you would find that they were all incredibly mediocre, extremely situational, and not particularly unique. All of the effects of these perks can be replaced by perks that are already much stronger that veteran players already have unlocked, and even if you're a new player, there's a good chance you could just use one of these other perks instead, which are all much more accessible and easier to unlock. And unfortunately, if we look at her killer power, the one thing that sets her apart from every other killer in the game, we also find some issues there. For example, you have to infect survivors before you can damage them with your head form, right? And in order to do that, you have to use her spit ability. This is a small projectile that you can aim freely, and when you hit something with it, it splinters into several smaller projectiles that bounce off surfaces. This seems like a really interesting mechanic, and it seems quite consistent at first, until a survivor gets close to it, and then you'll realize that the spit itself has a built-in auto aim. And this is not something that the game explains to you in the power description at all, but it is quite obvious why the developers added this feature. As we all know, the surfaces on the maps of Dead by Daylight are notoriously inconsistent. In some places you can bounce knives and other projectiles really consistently, and in others, whenever you hit them, they will bounce in completely random directions without any rhyme or reason. And that's really unfortunate, because this could be an ability with a lot of room for skill expression, but as it stands right now, it has very little depth. And another thing about the spit that is very disappointing is the fact that despite having a very long range, there is really no good reason to use it from afar. If you were excited about the possibility of landing some crazy trick shot on a survivor from across the map or over some big obstacle, you will quickly find yourself disappointed by the fact that there is no good reason to do this and no inherent reward whatsoever. If you infect people from afar and then go for someone else, you will quickly realize that her infection mechanic is actually incredibly counterintuitive and not in a good way. With most other infection-based powers, survivors have to take certain risks to remove it, or at least waste a little bit of time finding the right item for it. And if you infect multiple survivors, you will have multiple people wasting time for quite a bit. But with this killer, survivors can find mushrooms that spawn around the map and passively remove it while they work on a generator. In other words, if you spend a lot of time infecting multiple survivors, they will always have the advantage and you will never actually get anywhere unless you really focus on one person at a time. This is a shame too, because so many of her add-ons are dedicated to her infection phase when she really doesn't need them. And what this means really is that no matter how creative the Krasue player is, the game eventually reduces their viable options to just a very narrow few. And don't forget that every time you transition into your head form, you are spawning an extra mushroom on the map that survivors can use against you, which is honestly a bit of an odd choice that using your power is something that the game somewhat punishes you for. And finally, of course, we have to talk about her main power, the head form. This is the part of her kit that received the most nerfs. It's still quite strong in a lot of places, but in my opinion, it has become a bit black or white. In some areas, you get guaranteed hits no matter what the survivor does, and there's not a lot of interesting mind games on either side. And in others, your power simply doesn't work, and the only thing that you can do is not necessarily to get better at using it, but to just switch back to human form and deal with that pallet or that window, or do what a lot of people end up doing, bring certain perks that cover for your weaknesses, perks that are not necessarily very healthy or very fun to play against, and that ideally should never feel necessary to fully enjoy this killer. And one more prominent aspect of the head form, especially after all the nerfs, is the fact that survivors now have a real opportunity to body block against you if many of them are not infected yet. This is something that happens very, very rarely, but in the occasional match where you play against coordinated survivors, it can feel like an uphill battle, and I imagine that a lot of newer players find this very frustrating, and this is the kind of thing that would make them orbit away from the Krasue and gravitate back towards other killers that are simply stronger, smoother, and that do not have any kind of immediate counterplay like this one does. At the end of the day, the Krasue is not a bad or weak killer, but it is one that has suffered from very rushed decisions and from being part of a PTB where other big changes distracted us from some of her glaring issues. And I really hope that Behavior remembers how much love they put into this killer originally, and that they find some little bit of time here and there in their very busy roadmap and schedule to really tweak her and make her a killer that both current and future players will really get to enjoy.